Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to be looking at the election of 1912. It helps to formalize some of the ideas of modern political parties, as well as we will look at Woodrow Wilson's presidency and his package of progressive policies known as New Freedom. So we'll start with the election of 1912. If you remember from our last notes, there was a split in the Republican Party over Taft and Roosevelt's kind of falling out with each other. Taft was not as progressive as Roosevelt and some of the more progressive members of the Republican Party wanted. And so Taft is going to attract the more conservative wing of the Republican Party that prefers more compromises on progressivism, whereas Roosevelt is going to form his own third party called the Bull Moose Party, which is going to attract some more progressive beliefs and some more progressive Republicans. For the Democratic Party, they are running with a man named Woodrow Wilson. And then there's the Socialist Party of America, who is running with Eugene Debs. And we'll talk more about Eugene Debs later on in this unit. But yes, there was a Socialist Party, and Eugene Debs actually runs 5 times for president. Doesn't win, actually doesn't get any electoral votes. However, this election is important because what we see here is Roosevelt is essentially, when creating his third party, splitting the Republican vote between himself and Taft, which actually creates a big advantage for Wilson. Roosevelt also, in his Bull Moose Party, actually gained most third party votes in American history. He even earned several states, and he got more electoral votes and more votes than Taft did anyway. However, if you look at our electoral map, we can see that Woodrow Wilson is a clear electoral college winner and will become the next president. But some of you guys have probably been thinking, when did the Republican and Democratic parties start to resemble more like what they are today? Well, it's largely after the 1912 election. The Republican Party moving forward tends to believe in less federal government intervention, kind of like Taft was doing. And we'll see this more with the deregulation of businesses in the 1920s when we get to some of those Republican presidents. And then the Democratic Party starts to become more the party of big federal government. And we'll see that with Wilson as a Democratic president. He is going to be putting in place some policies that give the federal government a lot of power. So Woodrow Wilson's domestic policy package of progressive reforms is known as New Freedom, where he's going to try to tackle what he called the triple wall of privilege. That included the banking industry. The idea here is that most Americans couldn't afford to pay high interest rates on loans that they were taking out. Tariffs would be the second wall, and this is because tariffs are a tax on an imported good, but they tend to make all goods prices higher, and this is bad for the consumer. And then the other wall of privilege were trusts. These are, going to be monopolies and trusts that are limiting competition in the economy, as well as keeping prices high and preventing smaller businesses from succeeding, like the average person's small business. So we'll start with the banking industry. So with bank reform, Wilson wanted to find a way that he could quickly adjust the amount of money in circulation, and this would help to control inflation and deflation, which have been issues of this time period. And so he created with Congress the Federal Reserve System, which was a decentralized bank, basically meaning that there would be multiple banks, national federal banks around the country, that could issue currency in times of an emergency. So that would easily help to regulate inflation and deflation, as well as if they were banks in their districts, then they could transfer money to those banks to prevent them from collapsing or going bankrupt and then causing a panic. Also, the Federal Reserve works to raise and lower interest rates to either encourage or discourage borrowing and spending. So if interest rates are high, that usually discourages people from borrowing money, especially when they can't pay it back. But then if the economy is doing well, interest rates might go down, and this would encourage spending and borrowing in the economy. So essentially, what the Federal Reserve System does is it just creates a more stable economic foundation for our country to prevent things like economic collapses and panics. With tariffs, remember I said that tariffs increase consumer prices for all goods. And so Wilson wanted to lower tariffs. That is a progressive staple, is the reduction of tariffs. And so he worked with Congress to pass the Underwood Act, which greatly reduced tariffs, way more than the Payne-Aldrich Act of the Taft administration. However, if the federal government is not collecting tariff taxes, then they are not going to be collecting enough money. So lowering tariffs leaves a dent in federal revenue. Because of this, the 16th Amendment was adopted, which institutes a progressive income tax, which means that the people in America making more income would pay more taxes compared to people making less income. And you can see some of those tiers in the image on the slide. Not everyone agreed with the income tax. Some of them thought that it was, anti-American, anti-patriotic. It, went against liberty. However, the 16th Amendment still stands today, and we continue to pay income tax not only to the federal government, but we also pay income tax to our state governments as well. And then lastly, we said that Wilson wants to tackle trusts, which is, again, another popular progressive idea. And so he passes with Congress the Clayton Antitrust Act, which basically strengthens the Sherman Antitrust Act, the one that was passed in the 1890s. This law also legalizes unions and strikes, so it provides more protections for workers. His administration also established the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, which is essentially a federal agency that acts as like a watchdog, or it supervises business practices. It keeps an eye out for business corruption and possibly trying to create, mergers and trusts. And it may even require companies to submit financial reports at certain times, again, just to kind of watch for any type of corrupt business practices that could hurt the consumer. You can see in that image below that the trusts were obstructing competition, right? And so by breaking up trusts with things like the FTC or the Clayton Antitrust Act, then hopefully the highway of competition will be open again, and there will be lower prices for consumers, as well as, you see, this is called the little fellow. The average American who's trying to open a business could hopefully compete in this type of economy, and that would open up prosperity for more Americans. Okay, so far, we've talked about these three progressive presidents. We talked about, their varying degrees of progressivism and some of the things that they, were trying to accomplish to increase, equality and opportunity for a lot of Americans. I do want to recognize, though, that there is a huge gap in a lot of these progressive policies, and it specifically has to do with civil rights. Like I said, progressive politicians want to try to increase opportunities for Americans. However, they specifically did not support civil rights or opportunities or equality for Black Americans. And so I kind of gave you just a quick rundown of each president's racial views. So with Roosevelt, he did appoint some Black Americans into government positions. He invited Booker T. Washington, who was a famous civil rights leader at this time, to the White House. However, when it came to the strengthening of what was going on in the South with Jim Crow laws, when it came to lynchings, when it came to racial violence and discrimination nationwide, he really did nothing to try to protect the rights of Black Americans with any type of legislation. He didn't use his bully pulpit per se to speak out on issues of race. Taft, he wasn't a super effective president anyway, and he just remained kind of largely silent on racial issues and basically ignored it. And then Wilson is remembered in history as being a pretty staunch racist. He was a very strict segregationist. He supported Jim Crow laws nationwide. This is going to just strengthen and perpetuate systemic racism in the US. He failed to support a federal anti-lynching law that would have made lynching a federal crime. He did not want anything to do with that. And then he's also famous for hosting a screening of the incredibly racist film, The Birth of a Nation, at the White House. Basically, The Birth of a Nation was a movie that came out during this time in like the 1910s. About the Reconstruction South. It was incredibly racist. It had racist depictions and portrayals of Black people in the South, and it actually increased and strengthened KKK activity during this time. So yes, while the KKK was established in Reconstruction, actually its height of activity is going to be in the 1910s and 1920s. And some of that is because of the movie Birth of a Nation that Wilson showed at the White House. So we'll be coming back to these issues on race in the progressive era on some objectives later on in this unit. I just thought that it was important to recognize it now as we're talking about these presidents and some of their progressive accomplishments. We need to also recognize some of the stains on their legacies as well.